George Liele was born a slave in the year 1750 in the state of Virginia and then was later moved down to Georgia. Just 25 years later, Liele became a Christian and was baptized in the church of his master, Henry Sharp. Soon after his own conversion, Liele became concerned about the spiritual condition of his fellow slaves and began preaching to them. Liele preached for 2 years in the slave quarters of the plantations around South Carolina and Savannah. Just 2 years after coming to Christ, Liele was ordained, becoming the very first ordained African-American Baptist preacher in America. After his ordination, he planted the first African-American Baptist church in North America, a church that is still in existence today. This is a good time to pause and talk about slave preachers. These were slaves that were ordained only to preach to other slaves. Slave preachers would have liberties and freedoms to preach, presiding over slave funerals, weddings, and even baptisms. The slave preachers ended up becoming an influential part of the slave community, as well as the ones speaking into the spiritual life of the slaves. But honestly, these pseudo liberties and freedoms were only extended if the slave preacher didn't interfere with the other slaves' work. Were allowed to travel wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted. But I think this is the part that is worth noting. They were carefully watched. They had to straddle between the demands of their own conscience and the orders of the master. On one hand, they were criticized by the slaves for being the mouthpiece of the master. And on the other hand, some of these slave preachers spoke about liberty and freedom in secret. And when these slave preachers were bold enough to follow their own convictions, the Holy Spirit, God Himself, would show up in the midst of these meetings, and they would go on for hours. There were only certain things that slavery could frustrate, but obviously never stifle. In 1778, Henry Sharp, Lie's master, was killed in the Revolutionary War. After his death, Sharp's heirs took matters into their own hands and tried to re-enslave Liele. Now, as a result of their actions, Liele was thrown into jail. Eventually, he was able to provide the documentation and he was then set free. Soon after Lie's release, a high-ranking official in the British Army befriended Liele and helped him to leave the country. This man helped to pay for Lie's trip to Jamaica. And after just 2 years, Liele paid off his debt and was able to provide the proper documentation for freedom for himself and his family. Even though William Carey may be called the father of the modern mission movement, sailing to India in 1793, the truth is George Liele, a black man enslaved from the U.S., left America and planted the gospel in Jamaica a full 10 years before Carey left England. Liele worked as a missionary in Jamaica, providing for himself and his family by farming and transporting goods. It is written that he never actually received payment for any of his ministry work. He preached, baptized hundreds, and organized them into congregations organized by a church covenant that he adapted to the Jamaican context. By the year 1814, his works alone produced some 8,000 converts. At times, he was harassed by white colonists and even thrown into jail. One time, he stayed in jail for 3 years for agitating the slaves. People often dispute the validity of Lie's ministry since he didn't travel to Jamaica with the purpose of being a missionary or evangelist. But my question would be, should we also discredit the many other heroes of the faith who found themselves right in the middle of God's will despite their initial intentions? Consider Joseph, who was rejected by his brothers, enslaved, and found himself in Egypt, and later the second-hand man to Pharaoh. I'm pretty sure his initial intentions weren't to deliver his people. Or what about Saul, who was later Paul, who literally was traveling trying to persecute Christians, but had an experience with God that changed everything? A hero can be defined as a person who is admired. The emphasis should be on how we finish and how we follow God. Liele died in Jamaica in 1828 at the age of 78. Let's celebrate George Liele, our unsung hero.